If I were to tell you that your child needed to undergo a physical examination to verify what their genitals are in order to be allowed to compete in sport at school, would you think that's acceptable? My guess is probably not, but in Florida and the US, this might just have become a reality. Last week, Florida's State House passed a bill that effectively means that schools and institutions can subject young girls to genital examinations if they want to join public school and college sports teams. While the law is specifically designed to exclude transgender girls from competing with other girls, the law would apply to any young girl suspected to be trans or queer. They could therefore be subjected to humiliating and traumatizing genital exams. It's wild that it needs to be said, but just because someone is transgender or even considered transgender, it does not mean that it's justifiable to subject them to invasive, humiliating, and traumatic genital exams. It's a gross invasion of someone's privacy and mortifying that people think it's remotely okay to do this to children. When I was young, I used to compete in track and field sports on a national level in Iceland. However, when I came out as trans at 17, I quit sport and abandoned my dreams of an athletic career, as I feared the discrimination that I might face. If I were to grow up today, I might have come out much earlier, and a ban like this one in Florida would have been devastating for me. Think what you want about transgender people, but genital exams are under all circumstances wrong and cruel. There are no two ways about it. The thought of having to undergo such an exam gives me nightmares. As a trans person who has undergone surgery, I'm no stranger to medical examinations of my body. Even the ones I've had have all been for medical reasons. I still shudder at the thought of them. They were always uncomfortable, and in particular before I had surgery. Had I been forced to have one as a child, it would have absolutely traumatized me. The law shows a complete disregard for trans people's dignity and privacy and is a gross violation of people's liberty and safety. In my mind, anyone who plans to use this law should simply be charged for child abuse. This law is being passed despite the National Collegiate Athletic Association being unequivocal in their support for transgender athletes, saying that championships will not be held in states that exclude trans people from competing. It remains unclear why transgender people are suddenly being targeted now, as their participation in sport is not new. Since 2004, according to the International Olympics Committee, trans women have been allowed to compete with other women if certain requirements are fulfilled, such as having to suppress testosterone and having testosterone levels below a certain measurement for over a year. Since then, not a single trans person is qualified to compete at the Olympics. The exclusion of trans women from sport has a shaky foundation at best, and is often more based around false narratives of how transgender women will ruin the sanctity of women's sport, despite there being no evidence for it. They usually hide their anti-trans sentiment under the guise that women's sports needs to be protected and that they need to be fair. These arguments also completely ignore transgender boys or transgender men, which shows quite clearly the gap in their transphobic logic. According to many of these arguments, trans boys and trans men would be forced to compete with cisgender girls and women. In fact, this has already happened. Mac Beggs, a transgender boy who's 17, was forced to compete with cisgender girls in 2017 in a wrestling tournament, and was booed at by the crowd when he did win. Not only was he forced to compete in a category he didn't want to, but he was also criticized for winning it. This case, along with questions raised about women such as Caster Semenya's eligibility to compete in women's sport, shows us that our current binary and biological fundamentalist views on sport divisions are flawed. In my experience, people who call for blanket exclusions are people that are unlikely to listen to scientific evidence and nuanced discussions about the issue. They aren't guided by reasons, and their judgment is clouded by negative and often bigoted view of trans people. Bans on transgender athletes competing, like the one in Florida, only adds to an incredibly hostile society for transgender young people, not just in the US, but also in the UK, where discussions about trans people in sport is often as ruthless as it is cruel. Research shows that young trans people in the UK face high levels of bullying and experience heightened levels of anxiety and depression due to the stigma that they face. Instead of focusing on real issues women face in sport, such as lack of access, systematic sexism, and unequal pay, the focus is now being shifted onto a vulnerable minority group in a classic case of minority scapegoating. It's not a coincidence that the ones pushing for these bills are far-right politicians who have, historically, not been supportive of women's rights or LGBT rights in general. It continues to underline the clear connection between far-right ideologies and gender-critical views on trans people. While the UK thankfully has not banned trans women from competing in women's sports, and hopefully never will, the Rugby Football Union in the UK might end up forcing trans women who are above 170 centimetres and more than 90 kilos to undergo an assessment by a coach in whether or not they pose a safety risk under a new draft policy. Despite the obvious fact that there are cisgender women who are over 170 centimeters tall and weigh more than 90 kilos, they will not have to undergo the same assessment. This comes into play after World Rugby banned all transgender women from competing on an international level, which remains as one of the most exclusionary policies worldwide set by an international sporting body. The policy was widely rejected by national rugby unions that represent the top teams in the sports, including England, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. While the UK policy is admittedly not as extreme, it still falls short on ensuring equal participation for everyone. But thankfully, not all countries are as backwards as parts of the US or the UK. In 2013, California passed a law that affirms young trans people's right to compete in sport in line with their gender identity. The same goes for Canada, whose main sporting body for young people adopted inclusive policies in 2018. In Iceland, where I'm from, the National Olympic and Sports Association of Iceland released guidance for sporting unions in 2020 on how to ensure the inclusion of young trans people. I hope that more countries will follow the examples of these places, allowing transgender people to find safety in competing in sport and advancing their dream careers. But for me, these instances in the US and the UK also raise questions about the future. As more and more transgender people can transition early on, many trans girls would never have gone through a testosterone-driven puberty. Having access to puberty blockers and later on estrogen will mean that their bodies will have developed without it. All of these alleged advantages that trans women are said to have will therefore not be in place, and the foundation of all these toxic and divisive arguments will crumble. What will the critics say then? Will they finally concede, or will they find yet another way to justify their bigotry?